Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Today's presentation is titled Leaving Slavery, the Story of the Haitian Revolution and Its Influence on the U.S. Civil War. Our speaker is Dr. Robert Tabor, an assistant professor of history at Fayetteville State University in North Carolina, where he has taught courses on U.S., French, African American, Latin American, and world history since 2016. Dr. Tabor is a specialist in family life in colonial and revolutionary Haiti. He completed his Ph.D. in Latin American history at the University of Florida, where he met our own Dr. Bill Fisher. Dr. Tabor has published articles and essays on Haiti and co-edited the book titled Free Communities of Color and the Revolutionary Caribbean, Overturning or Turning Back. From August 2003 to February 2004, he lived in Haiti full-time doing volunteer work. About a month ago, he made a presentation for our Caribbean semester titled The Haitian Revolution and the Making of the Modern World. And at 1 o'clock today, immediately following this presentation, he'll be talking about foreign aid. Who is it good for? So once again, please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Tabor.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here. It's good to be with you virtually today. I'm looking forward to these two talks, looking forward to answering your questions and conversing with you. And thank you again for hosting me. In the years since I started learning about Haiti, I've found that there are three ways that people in the United States who aren't Haitian tend to get to know the country, either through mission work, whether that's a week or 2 years, military service, or as tourists. My story for you today begins 15 years ago, 16 years ago now, 17 years ago almost, in the seaside town of St. Mark, Haiti. I was there as a 19-year-old volunteer, expecting to spend 2 years total in the country. Haiti felt pretty remote from anything I had experienced before in Delaware or in Utah. It was tropical, it was hot, it was mountainous, but just very different. Getting to know the country in August didn't help. And despite 9 weeks of language training, I learned that there's a big difference between studying Haitian Creole and speaking Creole. By October, I could talk and mostly understand the people with whom I was speaking. And there I found myself in October of 2003 chatting with Alain, a 15-year-old young man, and we were just shooting the breeze. And he said, what were you studying in college before you came to Haiti? History, I replied. I had done 2 years of undergrad and thought I knew things. Oh, do you know about the help we gave you during the American Revolution? Well, I know that France sent ships and troops and supplies. No, us here in St. Mark, highlighted there on the map, we sent ships, we sent troops. In that moment, listening to Alain, my view shifted. Haiti was tropical, but it was no longer distant. It was part of the Atlantic web of trade, ideas, migration, and yes, slavery. When I returned to college, I would learn that colonial Haiti produced 40% of the Atlantic web's sugar, 50% of its coffee, and was responsible for 2/5 of France's overseas trade at a time when France was a major world power. And I would learn about the Haitian soldiers who fought in the Battle of Savannah in Georgia during the American Revolution, a preview of Haiti's own war for independence just 20 years later. By February 2004, I was living in Petit Goâve, another seaside town, but smaller, an hour west of the capital, Port-au-Prince. It was becoming clear as we listened to the news, as we looked around the country, that I probably wouldn't be able to stay in the country for a full 2 years. The political situation was getting tense. Every day brought new protests in Port-au-Prince, and there were rumors of insurgent groups forming around the country, getting ready to march at the capital. One day we were eating lunch at a roadside stand. Around the common table, the conversation turned to the political situation. A young woman back from college in Port-au-Prince explained, "This is the same stuff that always happens. We're living in peace, doing our own thing, just, living our lives when Columbus shows up. War, pillage, slavery, disease, we all die. The French need workers, so they go to Africa and they bring us more slavery. We rise up. We fight for our freedom. We win. Everyone else, they shun us. They don't want us to succeed on our own terms, just their terms. I would later learn that when the formerly enslaved fighters won, they chose the name of the country Haiti as a reference and honor to the Taino native peoples, the first natives to greet Columbus, who called the land Haiti, and the first natives to rebel against European colonialism. So here we are. The main question I'll be discussing tonight is how did this, or not tonight, today, how did the second story, the struggle to win and preserve freedom, above all, the desire to leave slavery, affect the first story about this, interconnected web? I will also be reflecting on why it was that I'd grown up with the impression of Haiti and the Caribbean in general as being so remote and disconnected from my own life, an answer that connects to the unfolding of the US Civil War and struggles for liberty across the country in the decades that follow. I begin today with the story of Marie Rose. We have just a few scraps of paper about her life, a baptismal record here, a prenup there. She grew up in slavery in colonial Haiti in the town of Léogâne. Some years there were more new arrivals from Africa. Some years France was at war. There were far fewer. A long war happened when she was in her teens, the war we know as the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. And in the last year of the war, when Marie Rose was 20, she gave birth to a daughter just as the sugar economy was nearing its peak. Freedom was better than slavery, but it was hard to get. Punishments for running away or rebelling could be severe: lashing, branding, amputation. Getting legal approval of one's manumission or achieving liberty from slavery was rare, even in a colony with a large number of free people of color. 90% of colonial Haiti was enslaved. Marie Rose did a courageous thing. She knew that legally, technically, judiciously, her daughter became enslaved the day she was born because Marie was enslaved. She didn't want her daughter to grow up in slavery. So she took her daughter, went to the town church, and lied to the priest. Yes, Marie said, "I'm free." The priest believed Marie, baptized her daughter, and even though Marie didn't know how to read or write, gave her a copy of the baptismal certificate describing her daughter as free. 24 years later, her daughter would use that certificate as proof that she had always been free. Her mother had finally obtained her own freedom just a year prior. Across the colony, a young man named Toussaint was growing up in a labor camp. The camp's owners were prosperous and would attend the theater in the nearby city of Cap Français, the Pearl of the Antilles, where orchestras staffed with enslaved violinists and pastries baked by enslaved chefs. The camp itself was large with a few hundred enslaved workers, mainly growing and processing sugar. The wealth from the camps, the sugar and coffee, indigo and cotton and cocoa, went to support the camp owners' lives in Paris and in the Versailles of Louis XVI. By the 1780s, colonial Haiti would be the most productive colony in the Americas, more valuable than even Mexico or Brazil with their silver, gold, and diamond mines, all in a colony roughly the size of Maryland. While enslaved, Toussaint appears to have received some tutoring from his godfather, a free man of color, though he hadn't yet learned how to sign his name when in 1776, the same year as the US Declaration of Independence and the year he turned 33, Toussaint also obtained his legal freedom. There are only so many jobs available in a colony focused on sugar and coffee production, so as the Marquis de Lafayette was making his way to the United States to fight in the American Revolution, Toussaint, now married, took a job in the same labor camp where he had been enslaved, working as a rancher, foreman, and coach driver, and using his earnings to lease a small coffee farm, along with a dozen enslaved farm workers to grow the coffee. He continued to get as much education as he could, developing a certain fondness for Epictetus, a Greek philosopher who had been enslaved, and the Abbé Raynal, a contemporary French writer unafraid to discuss the history of slavery and predict a reckoning for the enslavers. The enslaved found various ways to resist slavery. And the last time I talked with you, I told you the story about Telemaque, who was enslaved to a ship captain, was sold into slavery in colonial Haiti. He faked epileptic seizures until he was returned to the ship captain. And I also told you about the fisherman who stole a boat one morning. Enslaved fishermen stole a boat and the tackle and food and wine and took off and escaped. There are lots of stories, and historians use a database of the runaway ads to study family life, African culture, work patterns, and a host of other things. But there are 4 core things I want you to know about this whole running away phenomenon. 1, the people most likely to attempt self-liberation, which is the preferred term these days by historians, were men who had just arrived from Africa, particularly from Congo or Benin, and they were very likely to be military veterans. So those were the people who were most likely to attempt self-liberation. The people most likely to succeed in self-liberation were people who had grown up in the colony, who had friends and knowledge about where to go and when. Enslaved people found ways to both undermine or weaken slavery and to get through it, to make it to Saturday when they could work on their own crops, to Sunday when they could go to market in the morning, and then dances in the evening before returning to the drudgery of work. And for those of you familiar with Frederick Douglass's narrative, he talks about the importance of Sundays and holidays as part of that rhythm and part of that convincing, or that attempt to convince the enslaved that they did not actually want to be free. In Haitian voodoo, this is the 4th point, the family of spirits that was most respected, as we discussed last month, was the Gede, who were responsible for protecting the bodies of the dead, making sure that no one could turn you or someone you loved into a zombie, which would mean working as an enslaved farm worker or enslaved laborer forever. By 1789, the year George Washington became president of the United States, and we have the Constitution, colonial Haiti had a population of about 400,000 people. 9 out of 10 are enslaved. The free population is divided. About half are white colonists. The other half are free people of color. It's just a refresher from last month. There are substantial divisions within each group based on income, job prospects, and education, but the wealthiest white colonists are wealthier than the wealthiest free people of color. The enslaved have a name for the poorest whites, petit blanc, or little white. And again, there's that those great sort of moments early on in Frederick Douglass's narrative when he's in Baltimore and he's learning how to read. And part of the way he learns how to read is he's raiding the larder. He has free access to bread in the household in which he's enslaved, and he's treating it to poor white boys to get reading lessons. Or alternatively, he's taunting the white boys in the neighborhood by saying that he can write better than they can. And then when they try to show him up, he's studying how they're forming their letters. And that's how Frederick Douglass learns how to write. Historians debate whether racial segregation was increasing within the free population, but it appears that discrimination was. And this is something that shows up in the writings of free people of color in Haiti quite a bit. Meanwhile, France is sliding from fiscal crisis, where the treasurer for France during the American Revolution had cooked the books. He had taken all of the expenses related to France helping the United States in the American Revolution and placed them in extraordinary accounts rather than ordinary accounts, and then published the ordinary accounts for the first time in French history and showed that he had kept the balanced budget during the American Revolution. And the French were really excited because, he's a financial wizard who managed to do this. And then they opened the books, the new finance minister opened the books and discovered that France actually had tons and tons of debt that they needed to pay back, all these loans from the American Revolution, and the new finance minister had just kind of been stuck with the bill. This leads to political crisis, political just stalemates as everyone's trying to figure out what is it that we do. And one of the things that the French decide to do is, they're like, all right, we need to go back to the Estates General, which we used to have. We need to have, some political representation here, hear from the people. And what we're also going to do is we're going to get feedback from, people from across France, people from Haiti, free people from Haiti, but people from Haiti, people from, Martinique, Guadeloupe, they can send their lists of complaints to us and we'll tackle them. That's a good thing. You got to listen to people, right? But then people get this expectation that their complaints are going to be dealt with. And there's all this kind of back and forth. I mean, it's the French Revolution. And even in the National Assembly, there's back and forth and moving away from, the estates model to we need to be representatives of the nation. And one night when the liberals have a brief majority and a quorum, they pass the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in August of 1789. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinction may be founded only upon the general good. All right, cool. Who counts as a man? What social distinctions are for the common good? Does this apply in colonial Haiti, which is a French colony? And something we've discussed last time is that poor white men say that equality means they should be equal to wealthy white men. But the men of color are tainted by their association with slavery. Free men of color say that they're prosperous, educated, virtuous because of their militia service. They're serving the state, but unlike poor white men who were exempt. Wealthy white men don't want anyone to be equal to them, but they want rights and privileges from France, especially the right to engage in trade with whoever they want, meaning the United States. They're getting a lot of their wheat, their white flour from the United States. French like bread, not to be stereotypical. They like bread. And the United States, especially the middle colonies or middle states of Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, Delaware, have a lot of wheat to sell. It's a theme. And so the French are selling molasses and sugar, the French colonists are, to these wheat and flour smugglers from the United States. And they also don't want to be questioned about how they're managing their property, meaning they're enslaved farm workers. They don't want nosy government agents poking around. And as they argue and skirmish, and one of the two colonies' regiments deserts, the enslaved people in the colony start to think, well, now's as good a time as any. And so we have the first major rebellion in Haiti in several decades, starts near Toussaint's home in the northern part of the colony in August of 1791. Miles of sugar camps go up in flames as people burn the camps and then self-liberate, going to the hills. Insurgents, when they're being chased, will dart into cane fields, daring French soldiers to follow them, and then light the fields on fire. Many of the leaders were born in the Caribbean, including a voodoo priest from Jamaica, a man who'd been, kept himself away from slavery or being held as a slave for a number of years, a couple who had fought in the Battle of Savannah. Many of the rank and file in the rebellion are veterans from the Congolese civil wars in Africa, recent arrivals ready to fight to secure their own liberty and freedom. Some are Christian, some are Muslim, some feel bolder in battle because of the talismans they wear, which are connected to West Central African and West African traditions. Within a couple of months of the rebellion's start, Toussaint slips away and joins the insurgents. And the white colonists blame each other for encouraging the rebellion, while French revolutionaries especially blaming the counter-revolutionary plantation owners and enslavers for encouraging it. And we'll get back to the North in a moment. At about the same time, we've got Marie Rose, who we talked about earlier, and her husband, Romain, are in a dispute with their neighbor in the hills above Léogâne, up in these hills here. As the tensions rise, they decide to arm their enslaved workers because they themselves are enslavers and others from nearby camps. The rebellion becomes also a religious revival and a revolt against slavery all in one. And so as they're drawing on traditional Congolese and Catholic motifs, Congo had a Catholic king before Columbus arrived in the Americas. Romain announces himself to be the godson of the Virgin Mary, and he also takes upon himself the female name Romaine la Prophetess, Romain the Prophet. Prophet Marie Rose works alongside him as the rebellion expands to include around 6,000 insurgents, and they controlled a mountainous region in the southern part of the colony, sort of between Léogâne, Tigouab, and Jacmel, in these mountains here, which are lower than those mountains, but they're still mountains, which makes it easier to hold that territory. There's a Haitian Creole saying that's been made famous by Dr. Paul Farmer, Déomont, Guémont, beyond mountains, there are mountains. Mountains play an incredibly important role in Haitian history. The mountain chains separate the port towns and their surrounding plains from one another. They provide a refuge for the early buccaneers, including fugitives from slavery, people who had liberated themselves from slavery. They become the fortress of those who have fled slavery, those who are known as the Maroons. They stay up in the mountains. One of the big confusions that students often face when we first confront the Haitian Revolution, and I think it's really important to address it again today as just a reminder, is we tend to associate ideas of liberty with ideas of direct democracy and republican government. But in the early 1790s, the people who are liberating themselves from slavery, who are freeing themselves from slavery, have no real desire, no real trust in any kind of republican government. For them, republican government means the votes, and this is small r Republican, means that their enslavers, their captors, their torturers, their abusers have say over what they want, what they get to enjoy, how they get to live their lives. Whereas for them, their best allies tend to be kings. And so we have this very famous quote from McKeon, who's one of the insurgent leaders, that he gives in June of 1793. "I am the subject of three kings, of the king of Congo, master of all the blacks, of the king of France, who represents my father, of the king of Spain, who represents my mother." Spain had been providing a lot of support for the insurgents. "These three kings were the descendants of those who, led by a star, came to adore God made man." And so here he's connecting them in the religious mythos to, or the religious imagery, to the wise men who visited the newborn Jesus of Nazareth. And so we have this idea that royalty, the trusting in those who are divinely appointed, is what can bring liberty, rather than we have to be, establishing a republican form of government. As the Civil War, and some multi-front Civil War with the British helping the enslavers, the Spanish helping the insurgents, the French Republicans and Royalists fighting amongst themselves, the northern capital of Le Cap burns, and the French Republican government, as we talked about a fair amount last month, finally decides that total emancipation is the way of things they need to do. And as they implement total emancipation, total end of slavery, they win an important new ally in Toussaint Louverture, who has been studying this history. He's been practicing these tactics. Brilliant military leader, well respected by many of the insurgents, and he decides that he's going to throw in his lot with the French government. And when I'm summarizing quite a bit here. Toussaint gradually climbs up the ranks of the colony until he's the governor general of the colony, which really irks Napoleon, who sends a massive army to crush him that's led by Napoleon's brother-in-law, Victor Emmanuel Leclerc, and contains 30,000 soldiers. Importantly, the Leclerc expedition is also supported by many people, free men of color, who had been free, people who had liberated themselves from slavery and risen in the ranks, who were then alienated or pushed out by Toussaint. And what dooms the Leclerc expedition is two things. First, and most importantly, is the rumor that arrives from Guadeloupe, that the French are bent on restoring slavery, that while the French had proclaimed a general emancipation and end to slavery across the French Empire, in response to developments in colonial Haiti, that the backers of Napoleon and Napoleon himself are eager to restore slavery, and in fact have already re-enslaved the formerly enslaved people of Guadeloupe, the free people of Guadeloupe. And this really agitates people, as you might imagine, and enables a cohesion of this coalition of people who had been in slavery at the start of the revolution, people of color, who had been free at the start of the revolution, and some critical white allies, including famously some Polish and German battalions or regiments who defect from the French army, who feel that they cannot fight to restore slavery and will throw in their lot with the revived insurgency. The insurgency is familiar with the territory. They've seen a lot of armies come and go, and that they know that all they have to do really is go up into the mountains that they've gotten to know very well over the years. And the French take the port towns, and then the French die of yellow fever, including Leclerc himself. And then they come down out of the mountains and defeat the French at the Battle of Vertières in November of 1803, and then declare the independence of Haiti in June of 1801, or sorry, January of 1804, January 1st, 1804. we cannot underestimate the impact of the Haitian Revolution on the United States. And this is something that is going to be the bulk of our remaining time is going to be focusing on. First and foremost, as we're thinking about things, the United States, in 1789, 1790, 1791, was bounded on the west by the Mississippi River. And as many of you may remember, the British have a lot of forts in the Ohio Valley. There's also a lot of native nations throughout the Southeast who are still enjoying their sovereignty and the United States has assumed treaty obligations from Britain at the time of independence that they will then override during the Jacksonian era, leading to the Trail of Tears and other such developments. But even their claims to, we have the right to make treaties in this area only extends as far west as the Mississippi River. Spain has that right to make treaties across much of the central part of what's now North America, what's labeled the Louisiana Purchase here. They give it to France based on an IOU in 1802, 1803, with the provision of France, please don't sell this right to make treaties to the United States. Napoleon turns around and strikes a deal with Jefferson, giving him the right to make treaties in this area, what we think of and what we call the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. And that effectively will eventually double the size of the United States, of the settler colonial society over the ensuing decades. What also happens is New Orleans, which was a location, a destination of many white refugees who had fled the revolution in Haiti, will then become part of the United States. And we see this sort of huge outflow across the 1790s of colonists, of white colonists, of free people of color, and often taking with them enslaved workers who don't get a chance to liberate themselves before they're taken to the United States, much of which is slaveholding territory in the 1790s and early 1800s, including much of the Northeast. And so we have then in the 1790s is the establishment of the first Black Catholic congregation, or predominantly Black Catholic congregation in Philadelphia in the 1790s from free people of color who have fled Haiti. And then we also have various other pockets of refugees, including in Baltimore, in Charleston, in Savannah. The big surge to New Orleans happens when a group of refugees who had settled in Cuba have to leave Cuba after war between France and Spain erupts in 1807, 1808, because Napoleon decides to declare war on Spain and install his brother as the king of Spain, which the Cubans, as a Spanish colony, don't like very much, and so they kick out all the French. Famously, for those of you familiar with Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara comes from one of these French Creole families who had fled the Haitian Revolution. And so they bring with them these various stories, these various fears, these various worries, and this sort of this myth, really, of Black vengeance, of, this is what can happen if we ever let up, if we ever end slavery. We're asking for a huge insurrection. We're asking for, we're asking basically to be murdered in our beds, and don't you know that we have to protect society? We have to hold the line. We have to watch people even more closely, even more carefully. And after a major rebellion erupts in New Orleans, or just outside New Orleans, in the early 1800s, that becomes even more firm. And so there's that tremendous fear. As I mentioned at the end of our last talk, Denmark Vesey is implicated in a conspiracy in the early 1820s, and part of that conspiracy is this fear that Vesey had made contact with the Haitians, and that there was a huge Haitian fleet waiting off the coast of Charleston, ready to invade and to liberate people. That wouldn't happen until the Civil War, with Harriet Tubman's Combahee River raid, but another day. But there's that consistent, continual fear. And one of the big causes for the abolitionists becomes US recognition of Haiti. Now, John Adams had engaged in some diplomacy with Toussaint Louverture in the 1790s. And then Thomas Jefferson just cuts it off entirely. He needs the votes of Southern states to stay in power, as do many of our next several decades of presidents. They need the support of Southern enslaving senators and congressmen. And the North and Midwest aren't exactly big fans of civil or equal rights either throughout this time. And so we have, Charles Ray in 1837, talking about the lack of diplomacy to Haiti. In most other countries, we have ministers or at least consuls to watch over the interests of our merchants, but to send a minister or consul to Saint Domingo, meaning Haiti, would be so revolting to the feelings of our Southern brethren that they would probably threaten to dissolve the Union. And so here we have, even in 1837, which again is after there's a little crisis where trying to implement a law and the nullification crisis. So some talk of potentially a civil war, some type of dissolution possibly. But even then, there's this connection between, if we recognize Haiti, because we have merchants there, we just don't have formal diplomatic ties, that the South will secede. The people who are dependent on slavery for their own economic and political power will make sure that the South leaves the United States. James McKeon Smith, just a few years later, far from being scenes of indiscriminate massacre from which we should turn our eye in horror, these revolutions in Haiti constitute an epoch worth of the anxious study of every American citizen. So there had been this really big push to sort of deny the fact that the Haitian Revolution happened, to not speak of it. And Smith here is arguing quite the opposite. It says, look, we need to take some key lessons from here. We need to step up the implementation of slave patrols, of keeping an eye on enslaved workers. Frederick Douglass writes around this time, our government, under the influence of the violent slaveholders, has stubbornly refused to recognize Haiti. It becomes this cause célèbre, and thus severely injured the flourishing commerce we once carried on with that republic. This is rarely too contemptible for a government that has any pretensions to common intelligence. It is paying rather too much to gratify the color phobia of a few fanatics. And so just really calling out the United States' foreign policy at this time. And, again, that trade had always been going on. In 1790, our main trade partner here in the United States was Great Britain, but our number 2 trade partner was the French West Indies, where Haiti predominated. And so, to not recognize our trade partner because we're, this vital trade partner because of this fear of spreading slave rebellion. Abolitionists are just sort of constantly pointing this out, and it becomes this proxy issue for debating the future of slavery and how we think about civil rights. So after Lincoln's election, a lot of Southern state legislatures freak out. They claim that the election of Lincoln is illegitimate because he only got, votes from a certain region of the United States, meaning the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West, but nothing in the slaveholding South. And what they do then is, as they're looking to create a new country, to create the Confederate insurgency and to make sure they're not out there alone, the states that decide to leave the United States send out ambassadors to other states. These are commissioners. One book famously calls them apostles of disunion. And one of them is this Alabama commissioner, Stephen Hale, who goes to Kentucky in 1860. And here's what he says. The election of Mr. Lincoln cannot be regarded otherwise than a solemn declaration on the part of a great majority of the Northern people of hostility to the South, her property, meaning the enslaved, and her institutions, meaning slavery. Nothing less than an open declaration of war, for the triumph of this new theory of government destroys the property of the South, again, slavery, lays waste her fields, well, that's pretty obvious, and inaugurates all the horrors of a San Domingo servile insurrection, meaning the Haitian Revolution, consigning her citizens to assassinations. It was the enslaved who were assassinated on a regular basis, who were killed for attempting to run away, who were severely whipped, who were tortured. When they fought back, it became this study of Black vengeance, that you can't trust people, that you can't give people of color civil rights, that you can't free people, because what happens when they become free? And so it becomes this paranoid fear just because some people once fought back. And Stephen Hale is tying right into this conspiracy. The fears gained new life after John Brown, who had read about the Haitian Revolution, studied the Haitian Revolution, knew about the tactics of going up to the mountains, attempts to start a slave rebellion by taking the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He is captured. He's held in prison for a number of months before being executed. And John Brown is interesting because after his execution, there are a couple things that happen. One, the barns of all of the enslavers who served on the jury, all the barns burned, showing that the enslaved in Virginia were certainly paying attention to what was going on. But beyond Virginia, in Haiti, the Haitian state held a funeral for him. They didn't have his body, but they held a funeral in absentia for him, a state funeral, with all of the political and religious leaders from the Catholic Church, from the Haitian government, marching solemnly, declaring him to be a hero to the country, because they knew sort of what was at stake, and that John Brown was, on the same side as they were back in 1802, 1803, when they had to fight a revolution to prevent re-enslavement. And they considered him, this American who had never set foot in Haiti, to be a true friend to their cause of liberation. So there are a few conclusions that we can draw from this story, or other questions that get raised as we move into the period of the Civil War. Conclusion 1, a major challenge of emancipation is what happens in Reconstruction. What support, what help does the state provide to the newly liberated? What protections and guarantees of citizenship are given? And this becomes an intense history in Haiti. It becomes an intense history in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and it also becomes a very intense history in the United States as Reconstruction slides into Jim Crow. We get eventually Brown versus Board, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, to really put into practice the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the guarantees of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which then gets largely nullified by Shelby versus Holder from the Supreme Court just a few years ago. And so we continue to have these debates of, whose civil rights matter, whose voting rights matter, is voting sacrosanct, what protections, what support should be given. And this is where we also get into the debate about reparations, and also discussions we've had recently in our country about the impact and legacy of things like redlining and employment discrimination and criminal justice. And so, as I just mentioned, these challenges are not unique to the United States, and the struggles in countries, especially Haiti and the United States, are connected. The reason we don't think about or aren't taught about the Haitian Revolution is part of a deliberate effort to not talk about or to not think about the politics of emancipation and civil rights as worth considering, that it's this unit that we cover in February. Why are we even covering it and all that kind of thing? Instead of centering it as this core part of what it means to be American. What does it mean to be a democratic republic? What does it mean to talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to promote the general welfare? And finally, we don't gain anything by running from this history, running from the history of slavery, running from the history of liberation. We should consider carefully who we glorify and why, but I'd argue that glorification is the opposite of carefully learning the history in all of its complexity, which prepares us to be patient with ambiguity and with nuance, and that learning from the past prepares us to build a better future. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Who has a question?
Thanks very much, Dr. Tabor. That was fascinating. I was really interested in what you said about the idea of monarchical liberty. The idea that in some cases a monarch is a better guarantee of liberty that, for freed people than Republican government. The idea being that Republican government might just be dominated by slave owners. Have you ever run across that outside the Caribbean?
So I think this is one place where, and Dr. Fisher can talk about this quite more extensively than I can, But one of the challenges in Latin America that comes pretty apparent, and also in the United States, is the rights of Native peoples in sort of a more corporate model, meaning that they're recognized bodies and nations, and that the rights of Native peoples come increasingly under attack in Latin America and the United States as these countries, which are led by white Creole leadership, the white colonists or the children of white colonists, try to promote what we think of as classical liberalism, this idea of private property, very few restraints on trade, so on and so forth, and attacks on this idea of communal ownership of anything. And so, there's a lot of arguments, especially in the Andes, but also in the United States, of, hey, maybe we were better off, under this monarchy where we could actually have some protections of these treaty obligations being somewhat followed, though there were certainly lots of complaints and rebellions against, Spanish colonialism, as well as British colonialism, even before these wars of independence. But in the 19th century, this push of liberalism, private property, forced assimilation becomes really intense across the Americas. And I'd love to see more sort of comparative cross-hemispheric discussion of that, especially vis-a-vis Native rights.
What was the viewpoint of the petite blancs, of the little whites of the revolution during that time?
So for them, so the Petit Blancs view is that the revolution should work for them, that they should be given, especially men, that poor white men should have the right to vote, and that free men of color should not. That being a good citizen was dependent on being white. This is something where we've had a lot of scholarship in the last few years in the United States looking at this, where in Maryland and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, there are no racial restrictions on men voting in the 1790s into the early 1800s. And even Pennsylvania does not remove the right to vote from Black men who own property, who own land, until the 1830s. And then they make this switch where they, instead of defining citizenship or the right to vote and suffrage based on wealth and property ownership, they don't switch to universal suffrage for men, but rather to defining suffrage or the ability to be a voter on being free, white, and 21 and men, but establishing that racial component to citizenship. And there's a great book called Birthright Citizens by Professor Martha Jones from the Johns Hopkins University, looking at how this then gives rise to new legal theories, including birthright citizenship. That birthright citizenship is one of the few protections that really guarantees the right to vote for people of color in a post-emancipation, in a post-slavery context. And this is where we'll see, as we do these sort of comparative looks at what countries have birthright citizenship and don't, that if you're born in the country, you're automatically a citizen. We find that being far more common in post-slavery societies, especially in the Americas, to push back on this idea that we see in the Petit Blanc, but that we also see under the Jacksonian Democrats, that suffrage and the right to vote should only be white men, but it should be all white men. Looks like we have a couple questions in the Q&A, if I can see if I can access them. Yes. So this is a great question on whether Haiti went through a Reconstruction period after their emancipation period as we did in the United States. It's certainly very different, but they do, and I would argue that we're both still going through our Reconstruction periods. But in Haiti, a lot of it's centered around what form the economy would take, and whether the plantation system would be continued, or rather would people be able to go and start small farms, or just live their lives without being forced into labor, forced into working on sugar estates. And that was really one of the big questions in Haitian history across much of the 19th century, where the state was very invested in trying to bring sugar back and so they could tax it and make a lot of money off of it, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas our Reconstruction period, some of it was focused on this, again, this same access to land, free access to land, because think about homesteading, big project in the 1800s, but in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, you see a lot of racial restrictions on who gets land out west. Oregon prohibits Black settlement entirely. And in the 1870s, you have what's called the Exoduster movement, not from the book of Exodus, but also Dust and Dirt, where Black migrants from the South moved to Kansas to start homesteading, to get that land that's being opened. There's also this attempt with the Southern Homestead Act to provide land to newly freed people. But what happens is the land that's available tends to be a lot of swamps and pine barrens, and there's not much support. And so a lot of that land gets purchased away by land speculators. But so this big question of land, I think, is the most common or the largest commonality on who has access to it, who has control over it, the largest commonality about Reconstruction in Haiti and the United States. We have another question about the impact of the Haitian Revolution on European countries. Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so we tend to look at it in sort of two different avenues. One is what it does to economics and war and trade. And so Napoleon, after he loses Saint-Domingue, embarks on what's known as the continental system. And he's very big into sugar beet production, but also into sort of securing the markets. And this comes off of the work of a scholar named Margaret Crosby Arnold, where Napoleon is very inspired to, because France had been exporting the sugar, and the only way to make sure that you're still getting these imports from these countries is to take them over. And so he goes and takes over a lot of the countries that have been France's major trade partners. He's also very interested in getting new access to cotton and to other sort of tropical goods, which is why he thinks maybe we can get to India, which leads to his invasion of Egypt. And this starts before the Haitian Revolution ends, but he's thinking about this commodity stuff. What we also have is on the philosophical side, how do we think about things? How do we think about identity? How do we think about sort of the nature of human thought? And so on the question of identity, something that the French Revolution will go through all these kinds of discussions throughout the 1890s is, who gets to count as French. And it's, at first very cosmopolitan. If you ascribe to the ideas of the French Revolution, you've lived in the country for a year, you can become a French citizen. And then over the course of the 1790s and into the early 1800s, that turns to very blood and soil nationalism, which is deeply ironic considering Napoleon is Corsican, which wasn't part of France until 1760s, but blood and soil nationalism, which also becomes more prominent in Spain, in Germany, that has no consequences later, in England, in response to all these French invasions of other European countries, where they're thinking, okay, well, what does it mean to be German? What does it mean to be Italian? What does it mean, to be Spanish? We talk about latent patriotism in Spain after the French invasion, which then some would argue helps give rise to Romanticism. And this idea of, okay, we need to get back to our mythic past. We need to get back to what makes us distinctly German or French or whatever else. And then also most famously, Friedrich Hegel's The Master-Slave Dialectic is inspired by the Haitian Revolution. And so, yeah, it has a big impact on Europe in a lot of ways. Other questions?
Time for maybe one more. Any final question? Okay, well, let's give Dr. Tabor a round of applause for his excellent presentation. And Rob will give you about a 10-minute break before your next talk.
Sounds great. Thank you.